Never trust the first growl, the oldest kitchen maid whispered once. Sometimes it isn't a warning. Sometimes it's a cry no one else knows how to hear. Clara Hayes remembered those words every morning as she crossed the worn stone courtyard before sunrise with a basket of fresh bread balanced against her hip, her eyes lowered out of habit rather than fear. At 27, she had become the kind of woman people stopped noticing after the first glance. That was the safest way to survive inside Blackwood Keep. Servants hurried past without greeting her. Guards stepped around her as though she were part of the wall. Noble wolves looked through her instead of at her. Rejected Omega. The words had followed her for 3 years, growing heavier with every whisper until they felt stitched into the plain gray fabric of her dress. She never argued anymore. Arguments required someone willing to listen. Instead, she worked. She kneaded dough before dawn, polished silver until every candle reflected across its surface, folded linen with careful hands, and learned that quiet people often noticed what louder ones never could. The castle itself always woke in layers. First came the scent of fresh pine logs catching fire beneath the great ovens. Then warm bread drifted through the kitchens, followed by roasted herbs, strong coffee, and melted butter carried through long corridors lined with dark stone. Boots echoed overhead as guards changed shifts. Stable doors creaked open outside. Somewhere beyond the eastern towers, ravens announced another cold mountain morning. Clara loved those sounds because they asked nothing of her. They never judged. They simply existed. By the time sunlight reached the tallest windows, the keep had already transformed into the heart of an entire kingdom. Today felt different before anyone said a word. Servants whispered more quietly than usual. Housekeepers inspected every table twice. Fresh banners bearing the Blackwood wolf crest hung from carved beams polished until they caught the golden morning light. Even the air carried a strange tension, the invisible pressure that arrived whenever someone important returned home. Clara carried a tray of steaming oat biscuits toward the eastern dining hall and noticed something else no one seemed willing to mention. The castle was spotless, but every vase had been moved a few inches farther from the walls. Chairs had been spaced wider apart. Decorative armor had disappeared from the corridors entirely. Small changes. Practical changes. The sort made when everyone expected a frightened child rather than honored guests. She heard the news moments later from 2 scullery maids passing beside the pantry. The Alpha King had returned before dawn. His son was finally coming back to the keep after months away. Clara kept walking without lifting her head. Stories about the young heir had spread faster than winter winds. Some said the pup no longer trusted strangers. Others claimed he snapped at healers, refused tutors, and slept only a few restless hours each night. No one seemed to know the full truth. They only agreed on one thing. Something inside the little boy had changed. Clara adjusted the tray in her hands and continued toward the dining hall, telling herself it had nothing to do with her. She had mastered the art of remaining invisible long ago. Invisible people survived. Invisible people finished their work and returned quietly to their rooms before anyone remembered their names. She intended to do exactly that, unaware that before the morning ended, the first sound the Alpha King's son would make upon seeing her would change not only her future, but the future of everyone living inside Blackwood Keep. The great entrance hall did not become quiet all at once. It adjusted itself, one careful breath at a time. Guards standing along the carved stone walls straightened almost instinctively. Senior servants lowered their eyes before anyone instructed them to do so. Noble guests ended their conversations in unfinished sentences, leaving only the crackling fireplaces and the distant tapping of banners against the high windows. Clara stepped aside with her tray of warm oat biscuits balanced steadily in both hands. She had served inside Blackwood Keep long enough to recognize what true authority felt like. It was not loud. It simply changed the shape of every room it entered. The massive oak doors swung open, allowing cold mountain air, scented with pine and fresh snow, to drift through the hall. Alpha King Rowan Blackwood crossed the threshold without hurrying. He was taller than most men by nearly a head, broad-shouldered beneath a charcoal cloak trimmed with dark fur. His black hair touched faintly with silver at the temples that only strengthened the calm confidence in his appearance. Every measured step echoed across the polished stone floor. He did not search for admiration because he had never needed it. Respect followed him naturally, settling over the room as quietly as winter snow. Yet Clara noticed something unexpected before she truly looked at the king himself. His left hand remained lowered beside him, open and patient, as though waiting for someone smaller to decide whether it was safe to take it. A heartbeat later, a young boy appeared from behind the cloak. Ethan Blackwood could not have been older than 6. His dark hair fell untidily across his forehead despite someone's careful attempt to comb it earlier that morning. His small boots paused just inside the doorway. His gray eyes moved across the enormous hall with remarkable caution, studying every servant, every guard, every polished suit of decorative armor that had somehow disappeared since yesterday. Clara suddenly understood why the decorations had been removed. Nothing sharp, nothing startling, nothing that might unsettle a child who had forgotten how to feel completely safe. Rowan did not urge his son forward. He simply waited beside him, allowing Ethan to decide each careful step. The boy finally reached for his father's fingers, holding them tightly for only a moment before letting go again, as though testing whether the world remained steady beneath his feet. Clara felt an ache she could not explain. The castle whispers had spoken about fear, but they had never described this quiet determination inside such a young child. Head Steward Malcolm greeted the king with a respectful bow before introducing physicians, tutors, council members, and household staff waiting nearby. Ethan acknowledged none of them. He remained completely silent, watching every unfamiliar face with the careful concentration of someone searching for danger hidden inside ordinary smiles. One healer offered a gentle greeting. Ethan immediately stepped behind his father's shoulder. Another servant smiled warmly while carrying fresh flowers through the corridor. The boy flinched at the unexpected movement. No one criticized him. No one seemed surprised. Instead, everyone quietly adjusted around him, speaking softer, walking slower, pretending not to notice what every pair of eyes had already seen. Clara lowered her own gaze before Ethan could notice her standing near the side entrance. Invisible, she reminded herself. Finish your work. Return to the kitchen. But as she carefully turned toward the service corridor, the warm scent of fresh bread drifted upward from the basket she carried gently through the cool morning air toward the center of the hall, and somewhere behind her, small footsteps stopped moving altogether. Clara stopped walking without realizing she had done so. It was not because anyone had called her name. Almost no one inside Blackwood Keep ever did. It was because the hallway behind her had become unusually still, the kind of silence that arrives when every instinct in a room notices the same thing at once. She slowly shifted the basket against her hip and turned only enough to see the reflection in the polished silver serving platter hanging beside the corridor. Ethan was no longer standing beside his father. The young prince had taken 3 cautious steps forward on his own. His small eyes were fixed on the basket of fresh bread. Not the bread itself, Clara realized after another careful glance. On the small sprig of dried lavender tucked beneath the linen cloth covering the warm rolls. She had placed it there every morning because the baker insisted it helped keep the bread fresh longer. The faint herbal scent drifted gently through the cool mountain air, mixing with warm wheat and melted butter. Ethan stood perfectly still, staring at it with an expression that looked almost like recognition. Rowan noticed his son had wandered away but made no sudden movement. Clara admired that quiet restraint. Many fathers would have rushed to retrieve the child. Rowan simply watched, allowing Ethan to choose his own pace. Around them, everyone else became noticeably uneasy. A young guard shifted one hand toward the hilt of his ceremonial sword before another veteran quietly lowered the man's arm with a subtle shake of his head. Housemaids stopped carrying linens. Footmen paused beside the windows. Even the cooks peered through the kitchen doorway, pretending to polish serving bowls while secretly watching the unusual scene unfold. Clara immediately lowered her eyes again. She knew better than to invite attention. Rejected omegas survived by becoming forgettable. She took one careful step backward, intending to disappear into the service corridor before anyone blamed her for delaying the royal procession. The movement, small as it was, changed everything. Ethan's shoulders suddenly stiffened. His breathing became faster. A quiet sound escaped his throat, low enough that Clara almost mistook it for uncertainty before it deepened into something unmistakable. It was not loud. It did not echo through the hall. Yet every wolf present heard it instantly. The young prince was growling. Conversations stopped completely. Guards instinctively widened their stance without advancing. Two healers exchanged worried glances. One elderly council member quietly whispered that the boy had not reacted this strongly since returning home. Clara froze where she stood, her heart beating so loudly she was certain someone nearby could hear it. She did not dare look directly at Ethan. She had done nothing except carry breakfast through the corridor. Yet somehow every eye in the castle had settled upon her. The lavender fragrance continued drifting gently between them. Ethan did not blink. His gray eyes remained fixed on Clara, while the soft growl lingered beneath each careful breath. Rowan finally spoke, his calm voice carrying easily through the silent hall. "Ethan." There was no anger in the single word, only patience. The little boy did not answer. He neither stepped back toward his father nor moved closer to Clara. Instead, he remained exactly where he was, as though struggling to understand a feeling he had never experienced before. Clara tightened her fingers around the woven basket, silently willing herself to become invisible again. She believed the moment would pass if she simply stayed still long enough. She could not possibly know that the next decision would not belong to her, nor even to the Alpha King. It would belong entirely to the frightened little boy standing quietly in the middle of the great hall. The growl faded so gradually that no one could say exactly when it ended. One moment the sound rested low in Ethan's throat like distant thunder rolling across winter mountains, and the next it had become nothing more than an uneven breath. No one moved. The fireplaces continued to crackle softly against the stone walls. Somewhere beyond the tall windows, a raven called once before the keep settled into complete stillness again. Clara remained exactly where she stood, careful not to raise her eyes. She had learned long ago that frightened creatures often feared sudden movement more than unfamiliar faces. The basket rested lightly against her arm, and the warm scent of fresh bread mingled with lavender drifted quietly between them. Ethan tilted his head ever so slightly. His gray eyes no longer looked sharp with suspicion. Instead, they searched her face with the uncertain curiosity of a child trying to remember something from a dream. Rowan watched his son without speaking. His calm expression never changed, but those who had served him for years noticed one small difference. His shoulders, always perfectly squared, relaxed by the smallest measure. He was waiting, not commanding, waiting. Clara could not understand why. Every instinct urged her to retreat into the service corridor and disappear before someone accused her of disrupting the royal welcome. Yet another instinct, quieter and older, told her that stepping away now would only frighten the little boy further. She stayed where she was. Ethan took another step. The polished stone floor echoed beneath his tiny boots. Then another. A kitchen maid beside the pantry quietly covered her mouth with both hands. A footman stared openly, forgetting every lesson about proper court manners. Even head steward Malcolm seemed to stop breathing for a heartbeat. The young prince had refused to approach strangers for months. Now he crossed the great hall one slow step at a time, without anyone encouraging him forward. Clara lowered the basket carefully onto a nearby serving table so it would not slip from her hands. She folded those same hands together in front of her apron, making herself appear as small and unthreatening as possible. She did not smile. She did not speak. She simply waited. Ethan stopped only a foot away. His small fingers curled uncertainly against the sleeve of his own coat. His breathing remained uneven, but the fear inside it seemed different now, no longer pushing people away, almost asking whether someone might stay. Clara noticed the faint circles beneath his eyes, the tiredness no child should carry for so long. Without thinking, she remembered nights from her own childhood when storms had rattled the roof of her family's tiny cottage and her mother had calmed her without words, simply by being near. Slowly, carefully, Clara lowered herself onto one knee so that she was no longer looking down at him. The movement was gentle enough that the fabric of her dress barely whispered against the stone floor. She kept both hands resting openly in her lap, offering nothing except patience. Ethan looked at her for another long moment. Then, with complete innocence and absolute certainty, he closed the final distance between them. He leaned forward until his forehead brushed lightly against her shoulder. His tiny hands gathered a careful hold of her sleeve before he quietly climbed into her arms, as though he had always known they would be waiting for him there. A soft breath escaped the little boy, followed by the first peaceful sigh anyone in the castle had heard from him since his return. The silence that followed felt larger than the hall itself. Clara forgot every warning she had ever been given about knowing her place. She only adjusted her hold enough to make certain Ethan felt secure, one protective arm resting gently around his back, while the other supported him with effortless care. Across the room, no one noticed the warm bread anymore. Every eye remained fixed on the impossible sight unfolding before them, while Rowan Blackwood stood perfectly still, looking not at his son, but at the quiet woman who had somehow given the frightened child the one thing months of careful effort had failed to restore, the feeling of safety. For several long seconds, no one seemed willing to breathe loudly enough to disturb the fragile peace that had settled over the great hall. Ethan rested quietly against Clara's shoulder, his small fingers still holding the sleeve of her simple gray dress, as though letting go might send the calm slipping away again. The frightened tension that had followed him into Blackwood Keep that morning had vanished so completely that even the castle hounds lying beside the fireplace relaxed their heads onto their paws. Clara barely noticed the dozens of eyes fixed upon her. She focused only on the gentle rhythm of the little boy's breathing, careful not to shift her weight too quickly or speak a single unnecessary word. Then the silence finally broke. "Step away from the heir." The sharp command echoed across the hall. Captain Victor Ashford, commander of the Royal Guard, strode forward with measured authority, his polished boots striking the stone floor in steady rhythm. Two guards instinctively followed several steps behind him. Neither drew a weapon, but their tense expressions made the concern obvious. Victor stopped a respectful distance away, his attention never leaving Clara. "Your Majesty," he said without taking his eyes off her. "This situation is highly irregular. The prince has never approached an unknown servant before. We cannot ignore the possibility that something unusual has influenced his behavior." Quiet murmurs spread through the gathered nobles. One elderly council member slowly nodded. Another whispered that no ordinary explanation existed for what they had witnessed. Within moments, uncertainty traveled through the room faster than certainty ever could. Clara felt every word like another invisible stone added to the weight she had carried for years. Rejected Omega. Unusual. Untrustworthy. Different. The names changed, but the distance people placed between themselves and her never did. She carefully lifted her eyes toward Alpha King Rowan for the first time. "Your Majesty," she said softly, "if you wish, I will return your son immediately." Her voice remained calm despite the growing whispers around her. Rowan studied her expression instead of answering. He found no trace of triumph, no sign that she sought attention, no hint that she understood why the child had chosen her. She looked only concerned that she might somehow be causing trouble simply by standing there. Before anyone else could speak, Ethan tightened his small arms around Clara's shoulder. The movement was slight, but impossible to misunderstand. When Clara shifted as though preparing to stand, the little boy quietly shook his head against her shoulder without opening his eyes. Another wave of astonished whispers swept across the hall. Royal physician Eleanor Brooks stepped forward cautiously. She had spent months trying to help Ethan recover his sense of safety and had watched him refuse every comforting gesture offered with the greatest patience. She observed him now with careful attention before turning toward Rowan. "Your Majesty," she said gently, "his breathing is steady. His heartbeat appears calm. This is the most relaxed I have seen him since his return." Captain Ashford frowned. "Which makes this even more concerning. Or more important," Dr. Brooks replied. Rowan remained silent. Clara could not read the thoughts behind his composed expression, but she noticed one detail that surprised her. He had not ordered the guards to remove her. He had not demanded an explanation she could not give. Instead, he watched his son with the quiet focus of a father searching for truth rather than appearances. Around them, servants continued pretending to work, though no tray moved and no chair was adjusted. Every person inside the hall understood they were witnessing something the castle would remember for years. Clara wished she could disappear before becoming the center of another rumor, but Ethan remained peacefully asleep against her shoulder, trusting her completely, without speaking a single word, and for reasons she could not yet understand. Alpha King Rowan Blackwood seemed far more interested in understanding that trust than in taking it away. By late afternoon, Blackwood Keep had resumed its familiar rhythm. yet nothing truly felt ordinary anymore. Every servant carried the morning's impossible moment into whispered conversations that faded the instant a superior approached. Clara returned to the kitchens expecting to be dismissed from service or questioned by the council, but neither happened. Instead, head steward Malcolm quietly informed her that she was to remain available until further notice by direct order of the Alpha King. No explanation followed. Those few words alone were enough to make every cook, maid, and footman glance at her differently. Some looked curious, others looked cautious. Clara wished they would simply ignore her again. She found comfort in routine, so she buried herself in familiar work, arranging baskets of fresh herbs, preparing bread for the evening meal, and polishing wooden serving boards until they shone beneath the warm kitchen lights. The comforting scents of rosemary, baked apples, cinnamon, and butter slowly eased the tension in her shoulders. For the first time all day, she allowed herself to believe the strange encounter had finally passed. Then a soft knock interrupted the quiet. One of the younger footmen appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath. "Miss Hayes," he said politely, "His Majesty requests that you bring this evening's tea to the family sitting room." Every conversation inside the kitchen stopped instantly. Clara stared at the young servant, convinced she had misunderstood. The family sitting room was the most private chamber in the castle. Only trusted staff entered without special permission. Malcolm simply gave a single approving nod. "Go." Clara carefully prepared the tray herself. A porcelain teapot filled with warm chamomile tea rested beside fresh honey, sliced pears, oat biscuits, and a small plate of butter cookies shaped like woodland animals. She chose the simplest arrangement possible, hoping nothing about it would attract unnecessary attention. As she walked through the quieter western corridors, the castle seemed different from the busy halls she knew so well. Thick rugs softened every footstep. Tall windows overlooked pine forests stretching toward distant mountains. Family portraits replaced ceremonial banners. The room waiting at the end of the corridor felt less like a royal chamber and more like a home. A guard opened the carved oak door without a word. Clara stepped inside, lowered her eyes, and carried the tray toward the polished table near the fireplace. Rowan stood beside one of the windows, reading several reports spread across a desk. He acknowledged her arrival with a brief nod before returning his attention to the papers. Dr. Eleanor Brooks sat quietly nearby, speaking softly with an elderly housekeeper. The room felt peaceful until Clara noticed someone missing. Ethan was nowhere in sight. She carefully placed the teapot onto the table. Before she could step away, a faint sound reached her from beneath the large reading chair beside the fireplace. It was not a cry, not even a word. It sounded like the hesitant rustle of someone hiding. Clara instinctively glanced toward the chair. Two small gray eyes peered back at her from the shadows beneath the blanket draped across its side. Ethan had hidden himself there without anyone noticing. The instant their eyes met, the little boy slowly emerged, clutching a small carved wooden wolf in one hand. He did not hesitate this time. He crossed the room with quiet confidence until he reached Clara, gently took hold of the edge of her apron, and looked up at her with complete trust. Then, for the first time since returning home, he spoke clearly enough for everyone in the room to hear. "Will you stay?" The question was only 3 simple words, yet the silence that followed felt even deeper than the one that had filled the great hall that morning. Rowan lowered the report in his hands. Dr. Brooks looked toward Ethan with unmistakable surprise. Clara felt her heart tighten with quiet emotion because she suddenly understood something no one else in the castle had yet realized. The frightened little boy was not asking for comfort in that moment. He was asking whether the one person who made him feel safe would choose to leave him too. Clara looked down at Ethan, surprised that such a simple question could carry so much hope. She knelt beside him again so they were at the same height, offering a gentle smile that asked nothing in return. "I can stay until your tea gets cold," she answered softly. The little boy nodded with quiet satisfaction, still holding the small wooden wolf in one hand while his other hand continued to grip the edge of her apron as though it were the safest place in the castle. Across the room, Dr. Eleanor Brooks exchanged a thoughtful glance with Alpha King Rowan Blackwood. She had spent months encouraging Ethan to speak more than a few words at a time, yet the child had spoken naturally within moments of Clara's arrival. Rowan said nothing, but his attention never left the calm exchange unfolding before him. He was no longer watching Clara with suspicion. He was studying her the way a leader studied an answer that had appeared where no one thought to search. News, however, moved faster than truth inside any castle. By sunset, whispers had already reached the council chambers. Some claimed the rejected Omega possessed a mysterious gift. Others insisted she must have influenced the young prince through means no ordinary servant should possess. By the evening meal, the rumors had grown even stranger, changing shape each time they passed from one person to another. Captain Victor Ashford finally requested a private audience with Rowan. Inside the king's study, heavy shelves lined with old books surrounded the two men, while the last light of day filtered through tall windows overlooking the pine forest. Victor stood respectfully before the large oak desk. "Your Majesty," he began carefully, "I believe we should limit further contact between the servant and the prince until we understand what is happening." Rowan folded his hands together without answering immediately. "And what exactly do you believe is happening?" Victor hesitated. "I do not know. That uncertainty alone is reason enough for caution." Rowan considered the answer before speaking. "Dr. Brooks has examined Ethan more times than any physician in this kingdom. She says today was the calmest she has seen him in months." "That may be true," Victor replied, "but unusual trust can be as dangerous as unusual fear." Rowan slowly rose from his chair and walked toward the window. Below, servants crossed the courtyard carrying lanterns as twilight settled over the keep. "Fear has guided every decision concerning my son since he returned home," Rowan said quietly. "It has protected him. It has also isolated him." Victor lowered his head respectfully, but remained unconvinced. While that conversation unfolded above, Clara returned to the servant quarters carrying folded linens after finishing her evening duties. She hoped tomorrow would finally return life to normal. Instead, she found two senior housemaids waiting outside her small room. Their smiles were polite, but neither reached their eyes. One of them folded her arms. "You certainly found a remarkable way to attract attention." Clara sighed softly. "I did not try to. That is not what everyone believes." The second maid stepped closer. "Some people are saying you planned this. Others think you are pretending to be humble while hoping the king rewards you." Clara looked from one woman to the other, feeling the familiar loneliness she had known for years settle quietly over her heart. She could defend herself, but experience had taught her that rumors rarely disappeared because of explanations. They faded only when replaced by new stories. "I only carried bread," she answered honestly. The prince chose where to walk. The two women exchanged skeptical glances before leaving without another word. Clara entered her tiny room and gently closed the door behind her. She believed the whispers would eventually fade with time. She did not realize that while the castle questioned her intentions, someone else had already begun paying close attention to something entirely different. Ethan had not chosen her because she was different. He had chosen her because she reminded him of something he had been desperately searching for ever since the day he came home. The following morning arrived beneath a blanket of pale mist that drifted through the pine trees surrounding Blackwood Keep, softening the sharp edges of the ancient stone walls and making the entire castle feel quieter than usual. Clara returned to the kitchens before sunrise, grateful that work still followed the same dependable rhythm even when people did not. She measured flour, stirred warm oatmeal, arranged baskets of fresh fruit, and tucked another small sprig of dried lavender beneath the linen covering the morning bread, without giving the simple habit a second thought. It had become part of her routine years ago because her grandmother believed familiar scents could calm anxious hearts. Clara had never questioned the tradition. She certainly never imagined it might matter inside a royal castle. As breakfast preparations continued, Dr. Eleanor Brooks quietly entered the kitchen alone. The physician smiled warmly before asking whether Clara might spare a few moments. Surprised, Clara followed her into the herb garden behind the castle, where morning dew still clung to the rosemary and sage growing beside narrow stone paths. Eleanor looked at the rows of herbs before speaking. "Yesterday, I noticed the lavender in your bread basket," she said gently. Clara nodded. "My grandmother always used it. She said some people breathe easier when familiar scents remind them they are safe." Eleanor's thoughtful expression deepened. "Did she teach you anything else?" Clara hesitated before answering. "Only small things. She cared for frightened children in our village. She never forced them to speak. She never reached for them first. She believed trust grows quietly when people are given room to choose. The physician smiled with unmistakable recognition. That is exactly what you did yesterday. Clara lowered her eyes. I was not trying to help in any special way. I simply did what my grandmother always did for me. Eleanor remained silent for a moment, as though several scattered pieces of a puzzle had finally settled into place. Everyone has searched for extraordinary answers, she said softly. Perhaps Ethan only needed an ordinary kindness that expected nothing from him. Those words lingered in Clara's thoughts throughout the morning. She had spent years believing everything about her life was too small to matter. Yet the habits she had learned in a tiny village, from a woman no one beyond their community had ever known, had somehow reached the frightened heart of a future king. At nearly the same hour, Rowan sat inside the library reviewing the reports collected after Ethan's return months earlier. Every page described the same pattern. Physicians had offered treatments. Tutors had prepared careful lessons. Guards had increased protection. Everyone had tried to solve the problem by asking the boy to become fearless again. No report mentioned giving him the freedom to decide whom he trusted. Rowan slowly closed the final folder and understood something that had escaped every expert in his court. Clara had not healed Ethan because she possessed a rare gift. She had helped him because she had never treated him as a broken prince who needed fixing. She had simply seen a frightened child waiting for someone patient enough to let him choose. Later that afternoon, Ethan wandered into the herb garden, holding his little wooden wolf. The moment he spotted Clara trimming lavender stems beside the garden wall, his face brightened with quiet relief. Without hesitation, he walked over and sat beside her on the low stone bench, saying nothing at all. They spent several peaceful minutes arranging fresh herbs into small bundles, while birds sang overhead and sunlight filtered gently through the pine branches. Watching unseen from a nearby window, Rowan realized the greatest mystery had never been why his son trusted Clara. The real mystery was why no one else had understood that genuine safety could never be commanded, purchased, or earned through authority alone. Sometimes it began with nothing more than quiet patience, warm bread, the familiar scent of lavender, and a woman the entire kingdom had mistakenly believed was too insignificant to change anyone's life. 3 days later, the great assembly hall of Blackwood Keep filled long before the morning bells finished ringing. Council members gathered beneath towering wolf banners. Senior guards stood along the polished stone walls. Servants lined the back of the chamber, whispering quietly as they waited to learn why the Alpha King had summoned nearly everyone inside the castle. Clara stood near the entrance with the other household staff, wearing the same simple gray dress she had always worn. She expected nothing more than another ordinary day. Even after everything that had happened, she still believed her place remained among the servants. Then the massive oak doors opened. Rowan Blackwood entered first, carrying none of the ceremony that usually surrounded a ruler. Beside him walked Ethan, holding his small carved wooden wolf in one hand. The little boy looked across the crowded hall only once before his eyes found Clara. Without hesitation, he smiled. It was a quiet smile, but several servants immediately noticed it. They had not seen the young prince smile since his return. Ethan gently released his father's hand and crossed the hall at his own pace. No one stopped him. No one called his name. He walked directly toward Clara until he reached her side, then naturally slipped his small hand into hers as though it had become the most ordinary thing in the world. Another wave of whispers swept through the gathering. Rowan waited until the room grew silent before speaking. His calm voice carried effortlessly through the hall. For many months, every person in this castle has tried to protect my son. His eyes moved slowly across the assembled crowd. Physicians offered knowledge. Guards offered security. Advisors offered plans. Every effort was made with loyalty and good intentions. He paused before continuing. Yet one frightened child reminded us of something we had forgotten. Trust cannot be commanded. It must be given freely. Rowan turned toward Clara. Clara Hayes stepped forward without asking for recognition. She offered no promises, no expectations, and no demands. She simply treated my son with patience, kindness, and respect. The Alpha King descended from the raised platform until he stood only a few feet away from her. Clara immediately lowered her head, uncertain whether she should kneel. Before she could move, Rowan spoke again. Look at me. Slowly, She lifted her eyes. There was no judgment in his expression, only gratitude. For years, he said, many people saw only the title others placed upon you. They believed that title explained who you were. His gaze briefly swept across the nobles and servants alike. They were mistaken. Ethan gently squeezed Clara's hand before looking up at his father with complete confidence. Rowan smiled faintly at his son, then addressed the hall one final time. From this day forward, Clara Hayes will serve as a trusted companion and caregiver to the royal heir whenever he requests her presence. She will receive the respect given to every member of my household under my personal protection. No one inside this kingdom will speak of her with contempt again. The silence that followed carried far greater weight than applause ever could. Even Captain Victor Ashford bowed his head in acknowledgement, while Dr. Eleanor Brooks smiled with quiet satisfaction. The servants who had once looked through Clara now looked at her with entirely different eyes. Not because she had become powerful overnight, but because the truth had finally become impossible to ignore. Clara felt Ethan's small hand still resting safely within hers and realized that nothing truly important about her had changed. She was still the same woman who woke before dawn to bake bread, who tucked lavender beneath warm linen, and who believed frightened hearts deserved patience more than pressure. The difference was that someone had finally seen her as she had always been. As the gathering came to an end, Ethan looked up at Clara and asked if they could visit the herb garden before lunch. She smiled and nodded. Together they walked toward the sunlit courtyard, while Rowan followed a few steps behind, watching the peaceful scene with quiet gratitude. In that simple moment, everyone present understood the lesson that would be remembered at Blackwood Keep for generations. A kingdom had searched for extraordinary answers, yet the future of its royal family had been changed by the ordinary courage of one overlooked woman who chose kindness when no one was watching, and by one little boy brave enough to trust his own heart.